I want to start with a little bit an anecdote on when we organized this conference. Myself and several colleagues of mine who are in the field, working in the field of migration law, ask if I really am sure that I mean the GCM and not the GCR when I talk about protection, the protection scope. And yes, we do really mean the GCM, as we all heard also in the keynote. And yes, I will take, as Elspeth already pointed out, a more positive or a very positive approach now in my presentation. Sonia, if you could let us see what I'm going to talk about in the next slide, please. So I will briefly set the context with this presentation to talk about the issue of access to protection, complementary pathways, and the GCM. And I'm then very thankful that I can then hand over to my colleague Svesta, who will zoom in to very specific case examples of complementary pathways in the form of labor mobility access schemes and examples of the EU. So I will set a little bit more of the general context so we can then talk more practical afterwards. I will talk about the lack of access to protection as general issue in refugee law, briefly remind everyone what we speak of when we talk about complementary pathways, to then point to the relevance of the GCM, also with a view to the GCR in contrast. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So, as we all know, protection depends on access to territory, but refugee law leaves this question of access unsolved. The consequences are irregular flight routes, risk of trafficking, smuggling, loss of lives, and the GCR and the GCM both emphasize on the importance of safe and regulated access to territory, and both lay out complementary pathways as a form of access. Next slide, please. So what are complementary pathways? There's no legal definition, but UNHCR documents point out to in several instances that complementary pathways are a complement to resettlement. So all other regulated pathways other than resettlement, not necessarily with a humanitarian purpose. If you could click next. Yes, so there are complementary pathways with humanitarian purpose, such as humanitarian visas, temporary humanitarian admission programs, community sponsorship. We had a wide range of examples during 2013 onwards in Germany, admission programs for Syrian refugees, either admitted through community sponsorship where they had private sponsors guaranteeing for them, or through temporary humanitarian admission programs. And then we have the complementary pathways without humanitarian purpose, such as education and labor mobility pathways, family reunification. We will look at some of these later in Svesta's presentation. Next, please. So if we look at now at the GCM and its relevance with a view to the general topic of access to territory, we have several objectives which are relevant and important. Objective 8, addressing the loss of lives in the process of migration. Objective 9 and 10, preventing and combating smuggling and trafficking. Objective 11, integrated border management. And Objective 5, which I will focus on now, enhancing the availability of pathways to regular migration. Next, please. So Objective 5 has very detailed outlines to it. According to Objective 5, states should commit to adapt option of pathways for regular migration. And to realize this commitment, they should draw on the following actions. Please continue. We have the labor mobility, skills and matching programs, which we will maybe focus on later. But then we also have developing or building on existing national and regional practices for the admission and stay of appropriate duration based on compassionate, humanitarian or other considerations for migrants compelled to leave their countries of origins due to sudden onset natural disasters or other precarious situations, such as by providing humanitarian visas, private sponsorship, access to education for children, and temporary work permits, which we will see later. Next, please. We also have here a section referring to migrants compelled to leave again due to slow onset natural disasters, adverse effects of climate change and environmental degradation, such as desertification, land degradation, drought, and sea level rise, including by devising planned relocation and visa options. Next, please. And lastly, we have facilitating access to procedures for family reunification. And the academic mobility I pointed out in gray here, as I will leave that out for now. Next slide, please. So why do we have to draw on the GCM if we have the GCR, the Global Compact on Refugees, for protection seekers? So the GCR, the Global Compact for Refugees, addresses complementary pathways, just as I just referred to, but it is narrowed in its scope to refugees under the Refugee Convention. Not covered are therefore individuals in need of other types of protection, such as complementary, subsidiary, temporary protection, forced migration due to natural disasters, climate change, and individuals, very importantly, granted other types of protection. What does that mean? Although refugee status is, as we all know, declaratory in nature, refugees who are beneficiaries of complementary pathways themselves often live with a different humanitarian or other status in the respective host countries, not the refugee status. As an example, all individuals arriving regularly in Germany through the humanitarian admission programs, be they large-scale admission programs or private sponsorship, were not granted refugee status upon arrival. They were granted another humanitarian admission status. We saw therefore an access and a trade-off between access and rights at that point. And very important right that was missing for some of these people who might have had the same background as Syrians who arrived spontaneously or irregularly and then spontaneously sought asylum and were granted refugee status in the national asylum procedure. An important right missing was, for example, the right to family reunification, a right pointed out in the GCM as supposed to be enhanced. So these people could not benefit from it the same way as refugees could, as refugee status is, in the case of Germany, still the strongest humanitarian status we have. Next slide, please. So the Global Refugee Compact leaves an important gap for other protection-seeking migrants other than refugees under the Refugee Convention. The GCM, as we saw looking closer into the Objective 5, focuses on migrants. Yes, it even says in its preamble that it specifically distinguishes between migrants and refugees, as we also heard this morning in the keynote. It says that for refugees, there is a distinct refugee protection regime, which is fair because, of course, they need special attention. But the GCM can cover other protection-seeking migrants in its scope. For example, individuals in need of admission due to humanitarian reasons, as we saw. Next, please. As well as other types of forced migration, for example, due to natural disasters, climate change, and beneficiaries of complementary pathways with a view to secondary access rights, such as family reunification, if they live in a specific host country with other than a refugee status, although they might qualify for refugee status in theory. So I argue that the Global Compact for Migration has the potential to address a crucial gap in international migration and the international protection regime, because it can, if we use it the way it can be used, address the complexity of today's flight situation, of today's situation of forced migration globally that we have.